Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jo Davidge, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. On behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, Reed SC, the South Carolina Center for the Book, the DeKalb Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to another in our continuing series of author events. This event is, of course, one of the On My Mind reading series events that we've coordinated with the South Carolina Center for the Book. These events are specifically structured to celebrate authors, writers, and publishers on both sides of the greater Savannah River. We'd like to invite you, of course, to find out more about Georgia Center for the Book and the South Carolina Center for the Book by clicking on the links to our organizations over in the chat, and you can see more authors coming up in this series in the future as well. I'd also like to remind you that we do have a few events coming up this week with the Georgia Center for the Book, including the Lillian Smith Book Awards on Sunday, and a very interesting talk with Tracy Bailey on Tuesday. Once again, you can find more information about that by clicking on those links, or you can go to our Facebook page and that will direct you to register on Eventbrite. I would also like to thank Anderson Cook over at the South Carolina Center for the Book, who's been working with us on these programs now for about 12 months. It's a great partnership, and we're so pleased to continue it into the future. A few more reminders before we begin this evening. Once again, if you'd like to order copies of the books, we've provided links to local independent booksellers over in the chat portion, and you can easily order them by clicking on those. Our independent bookstores have done such a great job during this pandemic to provide books by mail, curbside pickup, and sometimes even delivery to your homes. So no matter where you are, we encourage you to shop our independent bookstores, especially our Black-owned independent bookstores. If you need to have the closed caption live transcription enabled for this evening's event, you can find that by locating the CC button either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. If you'd like to ask questions of our guests after the formal presentation, we like to use the Q&A feature just to keep the questions ordered. You can find the Q&A feature at the top or bottom of your screen. By clicking on that button, you can type in your question and we will answer those in turn as they come in. But right now, I'd like to get to our event and introduce our two wonderful panelists. The Appalachian Trail is America's most beloved trek, with millions of hikers setting foot on it every year. Yet few are aware of the fascinating backstory of the dreamers and builders who helped bring it to life over the past century. The conception and building of the unforgettable characters who explored it, defined it, and captured the national attention by hiking it. From Arnold Guyot to Grandma Gatewood, a mother of 11 who thru-hiked in canvas sneakers and a drawstring duffle, to the very famous Bill Bryson, author of the best-selling A Walk in the Woods. The Appalachian Trail has seized the American imagination like no other hiking path. The 2,000-mile-long hike from Georgia to Maine is not just a trail through the woods, but a set of ideas about nature, etched on the forest floor. This character-driven biography is a tale of must-read, not just for ambitious hikers, but for anyone who wonders about our relationship with the great outdoors and dreams of getting away from urban life for a pilgrimage in the wild. There's a strange beauty also in the lowlands that we're going to talk about tonight. At the heart of every mystery, and the mystery of the Carolina Bays, is an enigma that is lushly, uniquely beautiful. How did these odd geomorphical features come to be formed in the landscape in the first place, with their uniform shapes and matching elliptical orientations scattered across the Carolinas? There are many hypotheses, but no definitive answers. Featuring more than 150 color images, Carolina Bays takes you from an aerial perspective of these unusual bays to an on-the-ground safari, from frogs that croak and bark to skinks that skim across the water as if on skis. Life is found in astounding abundance. These wetlands are unique and almost immeasurably ancient. As is to be expected in the modern world, they are threatened by human intervention. Such diverse habitats and their rich, unmatched biodiversity call out for preservation and restoration. The bays are not only visited and documented by authors, They make an impassioned case for respecting how important these singular formations are for the health of our planet. And tonight, whether speaking about mountains or the Carolina Bays, we have two of the most intriguing and affable guides. Phil Dineri teaches courses on built environment at the University of Michigan. He worked in public radio journalism and state government before earning a doctorate degree in urban and regional planning at Michigan. He currently lives and teaches in Ann Arbor. Tom Poland graduated from the University of Georgia and is the former managing editor of the South Carolina Wildlife magazine. He is the author of South Carolina Country Roads, Reflections of South Carolina, Volumes 1 and 2, and Georgialina, A Southland as We Knew It. It has received the Order of the Palmetto and South Carolina's highest civilian honor. So will you please join me this evening to welcome Philip Dineri and Tom Poland. We'll begin tonight's presentation with Philip talking about the Appalachian Trail.
Sorry for that. There we go. Thank you for the introduction, Joe and Tom, for sharing this panel with me, and to all of you for tuning in. What I'm going to do is spend hopefully just about 10 minutes giving you a quick overview of what I tried to do with the book and some of the people that I profiled within it. And at the end of that, I'll give you a short reading that is set in Georgia, and then I'll throw it back over to Tom. So let me share my screen quickly. And there is the cover of the book. It's called a biography for a couple of reasons. One is that what I was trying to do was evoke the sense of the trail over its lifetime and how and why it is that people have grown very attached to it. Even folks that don't necessarily have a lot of experience hiking on it. The Appalachian Trail, and you'll have to pardon my Northerner's pronunciation, is a place that people know and love and care about and think of as a part of the American landscape, whether or not they've got that devoted hiker's attraction to it or experience with it. So what the book is trying to do is tell the story of the trail over its 100 years as a way of getting at why it is we've got these attachments. It's also called a biography because the structure of the book is a series of chapter-length biographies. Each chapter tells the story of a different individual whose own life intersected with that of the trail. And my hope was that in seeing how a person came to be interested in the trail and worked on the trail and what they sought from it, that then we could get a better feel for what the trail is about. So, for example, this is Benton Mackay. And Mackay, almost exactly 100 years ago, in November of 1921, published an article entitled An Appalachian Trail, a Project in Regional Planning. And that was what initiated the effort to build the trail. This is a picture of Mackay from several years later in Great Smoky Mountains National Park after the trail's construction was well underway. And on the right there is an image from a book that Mackay published a few years later called The New Exploration, where he set out a whole vision for how he hoped the American landscape would develop, how cities and the backcountry would relate to one another, how people could get new perspective on their life by going to the backwoods. And his idea for the AT was that it would link together small encampments that a few people would live in year-round, but that others would visit at different times of the year. And these small communities in the mountains would model a different way of life and give people a different perspective on and a fuller perspective on the cities and the industrial life in the valleys down below. For Mackay, the point of the trail was as a link between these communities. That was his vision for the trail. And over the course of time, he became separated from the trail effort in large part. Other people took on the mantle of actually getting it built. And they were primarily interested in it as a recreational amenity, as a place for hiking, as opposed to this larger vision that Mackay had. Then, and I'm jumping ahead to the 1950s, the trail has been built, it's completed. It actually fell apart in large part during World War II and was put back together and relocated in the 1950s. And a few people came up with the curious notion of hiking the entirety of the Appalachian Trail in a single summer-long hike. I say that was a curious thing to do because none of the early planners, builders, organizers of the trail imagined that it would be used that way. But widely credited with starting the tradition of thru hiking is Earl Shafer on the left there. In 1948, he was a little bit at loose ends. He was a World War II veteran, and he hiked the entirety of the trail the best he could find it in those early post-war years. Kept notes for a book along the way, and really became the first person that people associate with a tradition of thru hiking that since has developed, to be a very popular thing. It's how a lot of people think about the trail. A few years later, in the mid-1950s, a completely different person, Emma Gatewood, who was 67 years old, and was herself a product of and a child of Appalachia. She had grown up on the Ohio side of the Ohio River, right across from West Virginia in the Appalachian foothills. She was not your conventional outdoors person. She was not terribly experienced in the adventure of hiking and tenting. She had grown up in the Appalachian landscape as a working landscape. And after a very difficult life, an abusive marriage that lasted decades, Gatewood said, I want to get out into this country and enjoy it for its own sake. She did a very different kind of hike than Earl Shafer did, but she was the first woman to thru hike the trail alone. Another woman preceded her in thru hiking, but she was the first one to do it as a solo thru hike. So I profile these people. Jumping ahead, in the picture on the upper left there, you can tell in the center, that's President John Kennedy. On the right of the picture, to Kennedy's left, is Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson. Nelson in the 1960s led the effort to have the federal government provide permanent protection for the trail. The Appalachian Trail by the 1960s was threatened by mountaintop development of various kinds, vacation homes, TV antennas, ski resorts, you name it. And the properties that the trail ran through were no longer hosting the trail. And so the trail was being forced onto roadsides for much of its length. Nelson was from Wisconsin. He was from nowhere near the AT. But it's a mark of the environmentalism that was emerging in that decade that this politician at the forefront of environmentalism said, we've got to protect this trail. And that led to a legislative effort that ultimately culminated in the passage of the National Trails System Act in 1968. So this is President Lyndon Johnson on the right and his Interior Secretary Stuart Udall on the left at the signing ceremony for this legislation that not only protected the AT, but tried to create a system of national scenic trails across the country as a whole, a system that does now exist, by the way. So hopefully you can see as we move through these decades, you've got different people coming from different places in their lives and honing in on this idea of an Appalachian Trail and making the trail what they need it to be at that particular period of time. Jump ahead now to the 1980s and 90s. On the left side of your screen there are David Startsell, who was the executive director of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for several years, and Pamela Underhill, who was the National Park Service's director of the Appalachian Trail Park Office. The two of them really hand in hand, they are here on top of Springer Mountain in North Georgia. They did the work to get a trail corridor protected that the AT runs in to this day. So you get to the point where by the late 1990s, the Appalachian Trail, which had once been the fanciful notion of this dreamer Benton Mackay and the project of these lone enthusiasts in the earlier part of the 20th century. Now it's such a fixture on the scene that a best-selling author like Bill Bryson can, as you see in the subtitle of his book there, he can rediscover America itself by going for a hike on the trail. So Bryson is the last chapter profile in the book. It's the second to last chapter. The final chapter involves me visiting a few different sites on the trail and getting a picture of it in the present tense. So I thought I would wrap up by reading you just a short passage from that final chapter, which takes place on Springer Mountain, which you can see in that image, which comes from the book. So just a couple of pages here. On a humid July day, 3 young women kicking off a multi-day backpacking trip on the Appalachian Trail arrive at the top of Georgia's Springer Mountain, the trail's southern endpoint. Like so many mountaintops, Springer's summit does not announce itself with a craggy peak and a 360-degree view. The ground is gently, almost imperceptibly rounded across a partial clearing, and aside from a couple of small plaques, the site is unremarkable. Is this it? One asks. It is. So random, another replies. Not quite how I would have put it, but the young hiker's phrase does capture the feel of this place. So freighted with significance in the context of the AT, the landscape of Springer's summit is in person very ordinary. Based on the visual surroundings alone, it seems you could have placed the trail's endpoint on just about any southern mountain and the experience would be the same. Yet those hikers are here, as am I, taking notes, and soon a group of middle school-aged summer campers, and back in the spring, dozens of aspiring thru-hikers per day. All of us here for the plaques and what they signify. As with so much of the AT, it is the status of the trail, its identity as the Appalachian Trail, that attracts visitors to this point, more than anything extraordinary in the surroundings. It was to get at this identity, the collage of aspirations and associations that have drawn successive generations to the AT, that I began looking into its history. And in the summer of 2019, I consulted a final historical source, the trail itself, in a series of day hikes from Georgia to Maine. Each day I hiked a short section of trail for 5 or 6 hours, drove up the road a ways, and hiked a different stretch the next day. My goal was not to attempt any sort of definitive understanding of the AT. Even a summer-long thru-hike could not accomplish that, and my trip compared to a thru-hike, like a stroll around the block compares to a marathon. Instead, I treated the trail like one of the many archives I had investigated in researching this story. As when leafing through old letters or newspaper articles, I tried to observe the trail and its environment for the insights it had to offer. What seemed noteworthy? What patterns emerged? How does history shed light on today's trail? And how does the contemporary trail help us understand its history? I got lost on the first day. And that's where I will leave you and throw it back over to Joe.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Philip, for that wonderful introduction to Appalachian Trail. So why don't we now go and look at these wonderful environments, the Carolina Bays. Tom, why don't you explain to us a little bit about the Carolina Bays and tell us about your book.
Okay, well, thank you also for the nice introduction. It was 1982. Have you got me there on screen, by the way? I guess you have. It was 1982 when I read that a lawyer in Camden, South Carolina by the name of Henry Savage had written a book about the Carolina Bays, and he ascribed their creation to a bombardment of meteorites. Now, this appealed to me very much. I worked in film then, and it appealed to me very much because I was a child of Sputnik. I remember standing out in the front yard, 1958, 59, thereabouts, with my father and mother watching Sputnik go through the Georgia sky, blinking every so often. And I grew up as a child of the space program, and I was enamored of anything that had to do with outer space. And I thought, okay, we've got these landforms that meteorites created, gouged them out of the earth from New Jersey to the Florida Panhandle. So in a way, Philip, we have a trail of Carolina Bays that comes down through the coastal plain, the Atlantic coastal plain. So I was working in film then, and we went and we flew over a good many bays over in the Horry County area of South Carolina. That would be Myrtle Beach to a lot of people. And yet, despite the fact that Myrtle Beach is there, we do have a lot of beautiful natural areas in Horry County, Lewis Ocean Bay being one of them. And I got fascinated by these bays. Now, I'm not going to show you any pictures tonight. I want to talk to you about them because here's the thing. I want you to use your imagination. If I talk to 30 people in a room, one person may have heard of the Carolina Bays. To start with, it's an unfortunate name. They're not just in the Carolinas, but the best examples in some of the larger bays are in North and South Carolina. Like I said, they stretch from New Jersey down to the Florida Panhandle. And they were called Carolina Bays because of the North and South Carolina connection. But the bay aspect is really confusing. People think it has something to do with impoundment, water along the coast. Not at all. It's bay trees, red bay, laurel bay. They grow in great abundance in the bays. And so it was an unfortunate name that got laid on them a long, long time ago. What a better name would be, I have no idea. But let me just tell you what they're like. They're all shaped elliptically, like a woman's pendant. They're parallel to each other, from the New Jersey region down to the Florida Panhandle. That's hard to imagine, but they're parallel with a northwest to southeast axis. They vary in size greatly to a few acres to as many as thousands of acres, like in Grand Bay Complex down near Valdosta, Georgia. They're rich repositories of wildlife. You compress a lot of different habitat into a small region. You can go from pond cypress, blackwater swamp, to a grassy savanna, to a desert-like sand rim in some of the bays that are a little bit larger. The sand rim on the southeastern edge is one of their characteristics. And when you fly over them, it's astounding how consistent they are with these parallel positionings. When you drive by them on the road, this is why I think a lot of people don't realize what they're looking at. You see a swamp or you see a grassy area. You don't realize what you're looking at. But they're considered among the more unusual landforms that planet Earth has that science has yet to explain. I've heard some people say it is the most unusual, mysterious landform we have. I don't know about that. But I can tell you one thing about them. When you go into a bay, you're really into a real rich area of wildlife. You have amphibians, you have orchids, wildflowers, sedges, grasses, pond cypress, a lot of trees, canebrake rattlers, black bear, depending on what part of the region you might be in. And so they're very diverse, And yet, what fascinates people about them is the carnivorous plants, pitcher plants. The Venus flytrap, which Charles Darwin said was the world's most wondrous plant. I like to take a little time and talk about the Venus flytrap because it's only in Horry County as far as South Carolina goes. And you can find the Venus flytrap in about a 99-mile stretch from Horry County up towards Wilmington, North Carolina, and some of the piney flatlands. It's not just in the bays, but it really is an unusual plant in that it can move itself. It can clap shut. It's a single leaf that's hinged. And people want to know, well, how does it know when it's going to eat something? Well, that's pretty simple. It's open for business. And let's say it's a windy day, a little piece of pine bark falls into the Venus flytrap. Nothing's going to happen because it's inanimate. It doesn't move around. A fly lands in a Venus flytrap and he starts moving around. There's 6 tiny little trigger hairs in the Venus flytrap. When he hits one, nothing happens. It's like a security system. If he hits that same hair or another, a 20-second timer begins, and in 20 seconds, through a combination of sort of like hydraulics and a little electricity involved, the plant snaps shut and the fly is doomed. Then the enzymes start to secrete and the fly is dissolved and the plant has some nutrients because it grows in soil that just doesn't offer a lot to the Venus flytrap. So nature has come up with a way to supplement, its nutrition. Now, the pitcher plant is another wonderful plant that you find in all the bays just about. Now, I won't say all, but most of them. And it's not endangered. And pitcher plants exist in other places outside the bays too. It's a modified leaf that's grown into a tube. And it looks like if there's life on another planet somewhere, a colony of pitcher plants is what some futuristic city must look like somewhere else in a galaxy far flung from here. They're about knee-high. Some have hoods over them to keep the rain out, others don't. It's a leaf with convenient little steps leading down through its throat that lets the flies, the bees, wasps, and other insects, and some small animals easily get down to what they think is nectar. It puts out a sweet smell, as does the Venus flytrap, very subtle. And when the insect gets into this Carolina Bays pitcher plant, he gets down towards the acid. He realizes this is not where I want to be. And he turns around to escape, and now those downward pointing hairs are like the crossbars of a jail. He's trapped. And if the insect's big enough, it won't get out. It'll exhaust itself and fall into the acid and really become part of what it hopes to eat itself. So those really fascinated me in the bays. The sand rims fascinated me. And I found out that Native Americans loved to pitch camps there. It was an easy place to camp. Water was nearby, and so was food. Now, we have a wonderful introduction to our book by Steve Bennett. Steve Bennett and I worked together at DNR, South Carolina DNR, and he wrote a wonderful introduction about the aspects of the bays that he referred to as temporary water. This is the wonderful thing about the bays. They have no streams that lead into them. Oh, there might be one or two. No springs, there might be one somewhere. They collect seasonal rains. During the wet season, they fill up with water and they stay wet for a good while. But during the summer and early fall, they'll dry out. So this temporary water is important to amphibians. It means here's a place I can lay my eggs and my young can hatch, and I don't have to worry about predatory fish eating them because fish populations can't get established. If they do, when the dry cycle comes along, that'll be the end of them. So they're very rich places for amphibians, salamanders, cricket frogs, leopard frogs. And when you stand in a bay towards sunset, it's a deafening noise to hear all those frogs. You think a pond or a lake shore gives you a lot of frog music, you should be in a Carolina Bay. It's amazing. In fact, that's one of the things I was writing about today. I'm doing something else involved in bays. It's a 360-degree experience as wildlife goes. The bird song, the frogs, dragonflies, butterflies, orchids. It's a shame that some of them are so remote and difficult to get into that people never get to see these little gardens of Eden, I call them. And yet some of them are so big, they've been attracted to man and developers as places where we can build a lake community. Lake Waccamaw in North Carolina, if you look at a map, you'll see real quick like it's got that oval shape, northwest to southeast orientation. And if you go up there like Robert Clark, the photographer that worked on this book did, you'll see that there's a state park on one side that preserves a good bit of the bay. But on the other side of the bay, there are homes like lake homes. And you'll hear lawnmowers and weed eaters. It was the only bay we went into where we heard that kind of thing. We went into about 40 bays, I would say. We drove 30,000 miles over 6 years in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The longest trip we made was an 8-hour drive to Valdosta, Georgia, which tested our nerves. It was a stressful trip, but it was worth it when we got there. And they're just magnificent repositories of wildlife. Right here in South Carolina, we have a very interesting place called Savannah Riverside. Years ago, it was known as the bomb plant. It's where they made fissionable weapons material for the Cold War and all that. But today, the reactors have been decommissioned, and you can go there. There are 300 bays on Savannah Riverside's 310 square mile tract. I got a little bit of an argument once with an editor that didn't want to do a story on Savannah Riverside because of its nuclear power taint, we'll call it. And I said, yeah, but there are no Walmarts, there are no golf courses, there are no subdivisions, there are no streets, no interstates. It's a secluded region that has let nature reclaim it. The state record deer came out of it. Some people say, oh yeah, man, that's because radioactivity made it big. No, as Gibbons, who was the director of the Savannah River lab there once, the ecology lab at the University of Georgia once, Whit Gibbons said, no people is the reason they get big. No, having no people around is good for people, good for wildlife. And that's what I like about the bays. When you go in one, you won't see any sign of man's tampering if it's a pristine bay, that is. You won't see litter. You won't see fences. You will see grassy savannas, wildflowers, meadow beauties, various pitcher plants and so forth of different species. You'll see blackwater swamps, which mirror the cypress needles when they turn orange in the fall. So through the seasons, the bays are very pretty. And what we did, we went into these bays and we tried to give you a through the seasons look at how Carolina Bay changes and how it looks from season to season. They're beautiful at all times of the year. So we had two reasons we did this book. We wanted you to know that they're out there, because most people don't even know that. And we wanted you to be able to go inside and see what they're like. And my favorite chapter in the book is called Dispatches from the Field, in which I describe exactly what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, smelling and feeling at 24 different bays throughout the seasons. It's sort of a you are there reporting thing. And it's important for me to make one more point before I call it quits here. I'm not an environmentalist, although I believe in environmentalism. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. I'm just a writer, photographer, and my co-author is a photographer. And we've been around a lot of bays. We've rubbed shoulders with Steve Bennett, who is really knowledgeable about these. Steve and Dr. John Nelson pioneered a study of all the Carolina bays in South Carolina. It's just an astounding piece of work that to this day people use. So a Carolina bay, to sum up, is 500,000 of them. LIDAR, light imaging distance and ranging technology, laser 16,000 pulses a second from an aerial platform, can map these things in great detail. And it's discovered a lot of bays people didn't know exist. For example, you can drain one, timber it, and farm it, but that oval outline still exists. And the great news is, if you plug the ditches and leave the bays alone that have been disturbed, they will rebuild themselves. The rains will collect again. The certain aquatic plants will come back. The amphibians will come back. This is no short process, but over a long period, they will reestablish themselves. So we want people to be aware that they exist and preserve those that are undisturbed, and hopefully make some progress in bringing back bays that have been converted into farmland. So they're out there. Next time you drive along the coastal plain, Georgia, South Carolina, you'll see something, you'll see, well, that's a swamp. Maybe not. Take a look at an aerial map on Google and you might have just passed the Carolina Bay. Okay, that's my pitch.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much, Tom. And once again, if anyone in the audience has any questions, do feel free to put those in the Q&A. We have some great ones to start out with. So let me go ahead and dip into a few of those. So how has your relationship with the outdoors changed since your books have been published? And how would you all describe your personal relationship with nature? I know, Tom, you kind of gave us a little hint of that when you said you weren't an environmentalist. How do you all, feel about nature, and what has that changed since you researched and published your books?
I'll speak first to that. Every time I travel an interstate or go through a subdivision or see a clear cut where they're getting ready to build a new subdivision, I think about all the troubles that we have on the planet, of course, global warming and the things that concern people. And here we have these beautiful dish gardens, I call them, that are out there undisturbed. And yet, and I know that if certain people get their hands on them, they would try to make them in some kind of attraction, build homes around them all. So it really sort of depresses me a little bit when I've seen what nature can do, and then I get back in civilization and have to put up with traffic and power lines and all that litter and horns honking. So it's made me a little bit more of an activist, I'll say. I write often in columns and newspapers about nature. In fact, I wrote one last week about orchids and how you can find them in the bays. So it's made me a little bit more proactive. I don't take any of this for granted. But most people are too concerned with the here and now, TV shows. Of course, we got football season coming. But I enjoy the bays. For me, it is like a retreat into paradise. And I'll always be going back to them as long as I'm able to.
It's interesting. The approach that I took to the Appalachian Trail was trying to understand it as something that people built. And you can think of that as being, a little bit backwards from the fact that the Appalachian Trail gives us access to nature. It's a natural place. It's not a built thing. And I was interested in looking at, well, how and why did we create it, protect it, make it be the way that it is? So from the start, I was looking at the trail not as a natural place alone, but as a place with parking lots and trees that had to be cut down to make a trailway, and sites for tenting and whatnot. But you asked, how did working on the book change one's, thinking about nature, or change my thinking about nature? What's interesting is, even though that was my angle on the trail, was the building of it and the history and the human history of it, as opposed to its being a natural feature. Even though that was my mindset, when I would be out on the trail and hiking, I couldn't help but get that separation from the world that we go to nature for. I would notice the trees and the landform and the relationship of the water to the land. You hear the birds differently. You get a different perspective on the world when you go to these natural places. So to me, what was interesting was that even as I think we can appreciate the human stories behind these places, and it's important to not pretend that those human stories aren't there, even if you do that, you still don't lose sight of the wonder that nature can evoke in us.
I thought it was very interesting that Tom mentioned that the Native Americans would sometimes camp by the bays, and throughout the whole Appalachian region, that was such a huge area for indigenous peoples to live. And Katahdin is a Native American word, and it's very interesting that there was such a respect for those areas and how those areas were used by indigenous people in ancient times, and kind of how we've come back around to it, this protection, preserving, restoring. And I actually thought your introduction was also very timely, Philip, when you said that when you were looking into the book and when you have your 12 chapters, 10 of the 12 people were white men and 2 were women, and how environmentalism is sometimes a middle class kind of cause, and it should be maybe a bigger cause for all of us.
Well, the thing is that I think when we create these spaces of natural recreation and reflection, we want to imagine them as unpeopled places. That's what gives us the separation from our day-to-day world that makes those places so valuable to us. But as you point out, if you're going to imagine a particular landscape as unpeopled, you have to ignore the native history of those places. You have to, in the case of the creation of some of these national parks, you have to kick out the residents of those places, in this case, European immigrants, so-called mountain people that have lived working class lives in the hills and the mountains for generations. But because middle-class suburban America wants a seemingly pristine nature, we create a national park, and we use the power of eminent domain to move people out of there. So and in teaching my students nowadays, they come to the environment from a very different perspective than I'm 52, than I certainly did, which is they don't buy into this storyline of a pristine nature that doesn't have anybody in it. To students nowadays, if you're not talking about people, then you're missing an important part of the environmental equation. And that's just a different way of coming at things that I think folks of my generation are used to. I think on the whole, that's a good thing. Most new and fresh perspectives are, but it's something that definitely takes a little getting used to.
So Tom, we have a question that came in for you, and it's in relation to your book, and it says, as beautiful as the images are, that the questioner liked your point about using your imagination to picture the bays. And they asked, how would your writing have changed if the photographer's photos weren't featured in your book?
I probably would have done an even better job of describing. I can write very descriptive. When I broke into writing, I had a degree from journalism in Georgia and a master's in media. And my first job was in film, which was a tremendous advantage for me to break into writing, because I was writing not to be read, but to be heard, about professional voice that would broadcast. And I was always aware of what the audience would be seeing. So I was highly tuned in to visual descriptions. You know, if you're showing a wide shot, and you would pick something specific in that wide shot. If it was a tight shot of, say, a Venus flytrap, you would say some kind of general line. It gave me a great way to describe things. The photography certainly helps. It certainly helps. And but you could have a bay book without any photographs at all, and it would be intriguing. And I'll prove my point right now. I haven't talked about some of the theories as to how these things were created. Nesting whales, giant beaver dams, dinosaur footprints. Come on now. There's a bay in South Georgia, 5,000 acres. I'd like to see a dinosaur that's got a foot that's 5,000 acres. So some of them are rather ludicrous, and yet some of them are tantalizingly believable. Michael Davios, who's one of the theorists and he was very helpful to us. He gave us LiDAR images that showed in detail the bay's structure. He felt that an icy comet hit the Saginaw, Michigan, up in Phillips part of the world, up in that way, a long time ago, and I forget the epoch at the time. But he thinks it kicked out a slurry 8 miles high into the atmosphere that was a slurry mix of ice, sand, and water that landed along the coastal plain, and another part, so like a snowplow pushing, landed out in Nebraska, where they have Carolina Bay-like formations that are oriented. They call them rain basins. So he did something pretty remarkable. He plotted the axes of all these bays in Nebraska and the coastal plain to see if they would converge, and they were kind of all over the place until he corrected for the Coriolis effect, and they came right together over Saginaw, Michigan, where there is evidence of a big impact on one of the lakes there that something happened. But here's the problem. The bays all have varying ages, and they vary wildly. So it was a cataclysmic celestial bombardment. All the bays should have the same age. So the mystery goes on. Raymond Kaslowski did his PhD here at USC in Columbia, and his theory gets the most traction as to how they got their shape, and that it was an oriented wind and wave action over long periods. Prevailing winds will sculpt these bays into their oval shapes, but it still doesn't explain where the basin came from in the first place. It sits above the water table. So the mystery endures. It'd be a great read for someone that enjoys mysteries, nature, the inner workings of ecosystems, ecotones, and so forth. It's got some great information in it. So I would have done my best, but Robert's photographs certainly are sublime.
Excellent, thank you. Well, and yeah, I know, Tom, you mentioned all the travels you did researching these bays, and the question comes, Philip, why did you decide not to do a through hike, or is it possible through hike in your future for the Appalachian Trail?
You know, to be honest, my knees made that decision for me. The time when that would have been a physical option passed a long time ago. Like a lot of people, when I was younger, imagined through hiking, thought about through hiking. But, you know, the vast majority of the people who use the Appalachian Trail are not through hikers. The through hiking tradition is incredible. It's magnificent. You know, it's such a huge part of how we think about the trail that I think people can sometimes be under the misimpression that that's what the trail is for, or that that's how most people use it. And while that's an incredible part of the trail and its life and its importance to our culture, it is only a part. And, you know, people are using it for short day hikes. They're using it for hikes of, you know, 2 or 3 nights or a week at a time. It's got lots of different uses. So, you know, I didn't feel like I needed to through hike it to be able to tell the kind of story that I wanted to. My story is really a history of the creation of the trail, the building of it, the protecting of it, the laws, the bureaucracy that make it work. And to tell that story, why people did the things they did and what they were motivated by, that story was really in, you know, dusty archives. It wasn't in hiking every last foot of the trail. Yeah, I sometimes joke that, you know, there are lots of excellent books out there for through hikers, for aspiring through hikers, written by through hikers. Mine doesn't pretend to be that. My book is perhaps more for those people who have thought about through hiking, just imagined it, just attracted to this idea of a trail that goes for nearly 2,200 miles, where did it come from? And as I said, that was a story that was in historical sources more than it was in hiking every inch of the trail.
And there's, being a native West Virginian, we are the only state that was fully in the Appalachian Mountains. And yet there is just that teeny sliver of the Appalachian Trail that glances off of Harper's Ferry. You would think that it would have a much greater portion going through West Virginia, but it does not. But even just there at Harper's, so much history at Harper's Ferry. And I happened to be there the year that they found some buried canoes at Harper's Ferry that I believe they traced to the Lewis and Clark expedition or something like that. It was absolutely fascinating. And, was one of the only times that I had visited Harper's Ferry as an adult, when you weren't herded onto a school bus and taken out there and so given the 50-cent tour of the old town for a day. But, truly a fascinating place. And even here in North Georgia, some of the small, and the name escapes me now, but it's like a little archway that you pass under on the trail is just such a marker for people when they're either day hiking or through hiking. I hate to say it, they're almost like religious markers, it seems, to folks.
I don't think there is a literature out there, by the way, and I'm not fully versed in it, in how thinking about nature very much parallels and comes out of many different religious traditions. But I definitely agree with you that whether you're talking about natural formations like Carolina Bays or certain landscapes that you're viewing, or these structures that we build around them. A lot of people like to gather rocks and build little cairns on top of a mountain, or that arch that you're talking about. They all are these physical, visual reminders to us of these much larger stories of nature that we connect to and resonate with at this very deep level. I get Tom's book, which I haven't read. But I can tell is, rich in scientific detail. Mine is more from the tradition of the humanities, but both of them are trying to sort of tap into and use words to characterize this great big story of nature that, that provides such an important place for so many people. And those specific physical places are a big part of that as well.
And we can follow up on that. There's another really good question is, your identities as a Southerner or Northerner, respectively. How did this maybe shape your research and your views as you were writing the book? Clearly we can see, Tom felt a great ownership, it seems, of this. And how did maybe your current worldview shape your writing with that?
In my case, we were limited from the start by a contract requirement that we only cover 3 states: Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. And had we not had that, I would have liked to have gone on up the coastal plain as far north as I could have got to tell the story of not just southern bays, but all the bays. So as far as I'm concerned, these are like little gardens of Eden, little dish gardens from Delaware all the way down into the Florida Panhandle. Certainly Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina have their share, and maybe some of the better bays. But the thing it came out for me as a Southern writer was these things are down here. And a lot of my fellow Southerners don't even know they exist. When I give a talk sometimes, the most common question I get: did you see any snakes and alligators? People really worry about snakes and alligators. And I'll say, yeah, we saw them. We did. One day, Robert and I walked up on a gator. It was in some grass. We didn't even see it. It was there. It didn't bother us. And we saw canebrake rattlers. We saw copperheads, moccasins, a corn snake. But when you go into a bay, I don't worry about snakes and alligators. I worry about insects. I got attacked by a swarm of wasps at one bay. And I survived. I'm not allergic to anything. They're really beautiful places. They do have some risk. We heard a story about a photographer and I don't think this is anything but a myth, an old tale, that he went into a bay by himself in the watery depths, and his foot slipped down between two fallen trees and went between, they clapped shut around his ankle, and he couldn't get out, and he died of exposure. Could not run that down, tried my best. But I always tell people, don't go in the bay by yourself. They are wild places. It's not like going to a park. You know, you're going to get into some plants that can do battle with you. You're going to maybe come across a wild hog in some places. That's a real big problem in some of the bays. They're very destructive and they're very aggressive. But I came away as a Southerner very proud that we have these beautiful places that still are pristine in some places. And I'm hoping that we can do a better job of understanding them and protecting them and bringing back some of the ones that have been soybean fields, cornfields, and things like that.
Philip, how about you?
You know, there's a, not surprisingly, there is a fraught and difficult history between Northerners and Southerners around the Appalachian Trail. And I, you know, can't help but to a certain extent be a part of that. I was born and raised in upstate New York. I've lived my whole adult life in Michigan. And, you know, that means that without knowing it, there are things that I'm going to be insensitive to. There are you know, just knowledge that I'm not going to have. And in that way, I am a lot like a lot of the people who created and built the AT. The AT was primarily a project of folks from New York and Boston and Washington, D.C. And there was a thriving hiking culture in the Northeast that said, let's tie together these trails that we already have. And oh yeah, by the way, let's go down south as well. Now, there were local participants in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Virginia for sure, but they were organized by and directed by and sometimes bossed around by these Northern folks that were really driving the trail effort. That north-south antagonism goes all the way through to Bill Bryson's book. Bryson's book in the late 1990s has some, you know, just tired and cliched, you know, stereotypes of Southern mountain people that, you know, were offensive at the time to the people being caricatured in that way, and certainly don't read any better, you know, 20 years later. So I think that, you know, when we create parks and outdoor spaces and when we go to nature, as much as it's about the nature, it's also about the culture. And if it's about the culture, then that means there are going to be these tensions between black and white, between rich and middle class and poor, between Northern and Southern. It's a part of these places. And, you know, there's no getting around that. So, yeah, I guess especially speaking to a Southern audience, you know, I feel the need to take note of the fact that, you know, in a lot of ways, I'm clueless about the Southern Trail. I can speak about the trail as a whole, but that glides over these particular regional differences, and they're real.
Well, and, you know, and why don't we just stick with you, Philip, for a quick second, because we do have a really interesting question, and Tom kind of brought it up with that story about the photographer, but any sort of strange facts that you were unable to track down, dead ends, red herrings, something that you thought was going somewhere and you just couldn't substantiate it, you just had to leave it behind?
There were actually, one of the photos I showed earlier was one thing that I wish I could have gotten into the book, but couldn't. Grandma Gatewood, the image of her from Sports Illustrated when they wrote about her, was a great picture of her on the trail, and I wish I could have gotten it into the book, and I couldn't. No huge things that I couldn't track down. The one thing that I was hoping I could get in the book, but didn't, was I had imagined that I should say, Bill Bryson let me interview him for the book and was incredibly gracious and generous with his time. And he sat down and he answered my questions, and he answered all of my questions, and he was candid. And this was somebody who didn't need to do this. He didn't need to do any book publicity. He did it because he has been a writer who has needed interviews himself. And so he has submitted to tons of them. I did have this idea in the back of my mind that, hey, maybe Bill Bryson will share with me his notebooks from his trip. Maybe he'll let me come visit him at his house and we can dig through his shoeboxes together and find all the behind the scenes stuff. And I can put that in the book. And he made it pretty clear that wasn't going to happen. He would be happy to sit for an interview and answer all my questions, but we weren't going to be able to do that. So that was one thing that I had thought I might be able to do with the book that I wouldn't. But other than that, pretty much every story that I hoped to be able to tell, I was able to get a reasonably good purchase on. One of the challenges of working in archives, though, is sometimes there's just more there than you can deal with. You go to the such and such library and you allot 3 days and you read paper after paper for 10 hours a day for 3 days straight till your eyes are glazing over. You still haven't gotten through them all. But you've got to go ahead and do the best with what you've got. And so that's what I did.
Excellent, thank you. Tom, anything else on the mysteries
Yes, I have
or
something
anything
very
like that?
interesting to share. Sometimes when you talk about a book, it's out and it's in print, and there it is, you hold it in your hand. You have to ask yourself a question: what didn't get in the book? We had a chapter on ours, Carolina Bay's contributions to the pop culture, and that got taken out because of space considerations and all. But there's a song by Fleetwood Mac called "Hypnotized." It goes back a ways. Bob Welch wrote the song, and he sang it. It's a very haunting, beautiful song. All you people out there in Google land tonight, look this song up and listen. He talks about a strange, strange pond in North Carolina with sides like glass. And it was a kind of a place that the hands of man had made it would have showed. It was a pond in the middle of a forest with no way in. It was a Carolina Bay he was referring to. That's just one example of the bays in popular culture. And I was writing about this just recently, and I used it in something else. I wrote a story called My Atomic Paradise, which was about Savannah Riverside, because down at Savannah Riverside, there's a bay called Rainbow Bay, and it's within a mile of one of the reactors that's been decommissioned. That reactor was decommissioned in '64. It had a problem. They went in and they filled it full of some cement with a certain kind of foam that retains radioactivity. And it became like a solid rock, like a iceberg. 7/8 of it is below ground. You don't see it. And they welded the steel doors shut, and it's to stay that way for 1,400 years. We couldn't take pictures of it. We're not allowed. We could not go there by ourselves. We had to be escorted all the time. Just a mile away is Rainbow Bay, which is in the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest continuing running amphibian study. So, My Atomic Paradise, Heaven and Hell, right there in one spot. That's in the book. We did write about that. It's a fascinating subject, really, the Carolina Bays.
It very much sounds like it. I can't wait to get through the book as well. So we're almost at the top of the hour. So folks, once again, a reminder, if anybody has any last minute questions, also don't forget, we have the links to order copies of the book over in the chat, and those will take you right to the bookstores. So you can get those ordered and get them popped in the mail as soon as you can. But as we wrap up this evening, what are you all working on now? Where is your research leading you? I know, Philip, you're teaching currently, but maybe what are you formulating for your next book?
I'm noodling, but you're right. I'm trying to teach. I've got an idea of what I might do next. It's not clear, so I'll defer to Tom on that.
I just put out 8 books in the last 10 years, mostly all nonfiction. I did a book called The Last Sunday Drive, which came out the same month the Carolina Bay book did, just in time for COVID-19. I'm working on an experimental book right now that involves a variety of settings, and Carolina Bay is one of them. It's a work of fiction. I'm about 60,000 words into it.
Oh, wow. Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much for your wonderful books. And of course, Tom, your
Thank you.
Slightly older book, but always glad to have it here in the office to hold up and refer to. And thank you all for joining us here this evening to hear these fascinating talks about Carolina Bays and the Appalachian Trail. we hope that they inspire you to get out and enjoy nature a little more. And we look forward to another in our On My Mind series of events coming up in October. So do sign up either with the Georgia Center for the Book or the South Carolina Center for the Book to be informed of those talks as they are scheduled. Tom, Philip, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thank you all for welcoming us into your homes. We will see you again very, very soon. Have a wonderful evening.
Take care.